Professor Yadav, actually, the reason why we're super excited to have him is because I think that there are very few people really, actually in the world who kind of wear these many hats with so much elan. So he's a political scientist, he's a psephologist, he's a political commentator. He works in the area of public policy and is most recently the founder of a political party that's going to contest elections. And so very rarely, which is why we really couldn't give up the opportunity to have him here, do you have all of these in one person. Officially, he's a senior fellow at CSDS, Center for Study of Developing Society, and also the founder convener of Lokniti for any one of us who've ever looked at election data or wanted to know anything to do with an election survey, is kind of in a way the gold standard and the pioneer of this kind of research. But in addition, Professor Yadav has strong interests in political theory, democratic theory in particular, and is the author of, I think, at least 3 books. Most recently, with Al Stepan and Juan Linz, the very influential book on democracy in multinational society about Kraken state nations, which I think is a tremendously interesting concept. He, of course, is a familiar face to anyone who watches Indian television or reads Indian newspapers. And he's also, and for those of us who've been through the Indian education system, I think this is one of the one of his hats, which I think I'm particularly happy about, is that he is a member of the Governing Council of the Indian Council of Social Science Research, but also Chief Advisory Officer for NCRT, which means he decides what people like us, when they're from class 9 to class 12, which for you guys is probably from the ages of 14, 17, 13, 17, read in a political science textbook, which, trust me, has never been something really exciting. So I think that this is another great opportunity in a way that Professor Yadav has taken up. He is much feted, much awarded. He won the Malcolm X Award and more recently the International Political Science Award for global solidarity. But most interestingly, he has just so many interesting ideas and knows so much about a ton of stuff. And so it's just a fantastic opportunity to have him here with us, to talk to us, and to give us an opportunity to ask him things that are on our minds. So we just start off and then maybe just open it up. Great.
So I thought I'll talk about 2 broad questions which have engaged me for some time, and I hope I'll be able to write about these as well. But these are questions which engage, in a sense, all of us in one capacity or the other. And that's why I thought I'll sort of begin by proposing something, and then we can have a free-floating discussion and questions and everything. One is about, the first question is about how do we make sense of the contemporary conjuncture, the situation in India today. What is the large frame in which we see this? There are alternative narratives which suggest themselves about how to make sense of what's happening in India today. I have a proposal about that. And second, of course, the question about what is to be done. How do we see action? What frame? It's not that I have concrete proposals about what is to be done, concrete reading of India and so on. But let me just begin by proposing 2 frames to think about these 2 things, and then we can have a free-floating open conversation. So just 2 small topics. What's India like today? What is to be done? On the first one, different narratives suggest themselves all the time. There is, of course, the narrative of decline and fall of Indian democracy. It's been an old narrative, has suggested itself all the time, and any somewhat low moment, and we all tend to sort of slip into that mode. Decline and fall of Indian democracy, which was of course inevitable, which was there to happen because it could not live up to a given script of how democracies were meant to be. There is, of course, there are 2 versions here. There is a liberal democratic script of what India was meant to be. There is also the revolutionary script of what India was meant to be. Both the scripts don't seem to be working out, well at all. And there is therefore a tendency to slide into that, which gives rise to an alternative way of saying, no, all is fine, things are working fine, taking time. This is the official narrative of the Indian state. Things are taking time, but they are somewhat different. And look, we've achieved something very unusual. This was an improbable democracy. We have established democracy. Ashu is coming up with a book called, Story of an Improbable Democracy or something. So it's improbable in a strictly statistical sense of the term, that if you go by records of democracies and compare them, relate them to their levels of economic development, India ought not to have been a democracy or not have stayed as democracy. It was, if you go by any understanding of diversity and democracy, the older understanding, India should have disintegrated by now. So yes, the other narrative would tell you we were an improbable democracy, but now democracy is the only game in town. We were an impossible nation state. We are stable. Yugoslavia collapsed. Soviet Union did. India did not. So, and it doesn't look as though in the foreseeable future, next 10 years or so at least, it's going to disintegrate. So these two narratives are things we tend to slide into because somehow they suggest themselves. And for some time, I've been trying to think of a different way of combining the two, which is to think about entrenchment. It's all right. Just relax. It's okay. Perfect. I'm all right. Maybe sound makes it more real. So just is to think of something that I loosely call entrenchment. The good thing I like about this word is that it can be seen from both ends. Entrenchment is a nice thing in one way because things are, it suggests something which is taking roots. Looked at differently, and you don't want to be entrenched. It has a metaphor of being trapped, enclosed. And I thought that may well be a frame in which we want to think about what's happening to democracy in India today. On the two or, in some ways, Indian democracy is acquiring roots. That's part of the story that I have written about earlier. It's a somewhat well-known story of electoral democracy, of participation going up, of lower sections of society participating in ways which is not expected anywhere in the world, where turnout is going down or remaining stable in other parts of the world. In India, it's going up. That the lower you go down in the tiers of democracy, turnout and participation actually increases rather than go down. So we're looking at a very unusual story here. So you could say it's about democracy taking roots. Now that's one side of it. The second side is entrenchment as being protected from what were considered to be impossible challenges. I've talked about one. But if you look at the narratives of Indian democracy in the 50s and 60s, even today in some ways, there were 3 or 4 challenges that everyone talked about. And in some ways, I've now begun to think that probably that's a trap. It invites, Indian democracy in a sense invites us to think about challenges which are not really its challenges. And 4 of these, which are talked about by everyone, is caste, class divisions, ethnicity, and separatism, insurgencies, and so on. All those 4 were and are challenges. But I think Indian democracy has responded to it, the functioning, working of democracy has responded to it in ways that contains these challenges. Caste, precisely by being given a front door entry, has been domesticated. It's domesticated because everyone talks about it every day and everywhere. And it ceases to be a factor that can actually blow in your face. It's there. It's written into everything. Ethnicity. Ethnicity considered in the way of ethnicity was and is a challenge. But you mentioned the Nagaland and Mizoram situations and so on. The institutional mechanisms of accommodation have not worked perfectly, but they have in some ways contained and localized the situations in ways which did not appear to be the case 20, 30 years ago. Diversity in the case of the communal situation, the communal division, which was meant to be the biggest, which was seen to be the biggest challenge of India after partition, and rightly so, and which continues to be a serious challenge because at least in the case of Indian Muslims, the largest and disadvantaged minority of India, the situation is far, far from happy, as the Sachar Commission report has brought out. But it's precisely because the Sachar Commission report is out there in the public domain. The way I look at it is that this is kind of a turning point where the Muslim question is speakable in India. You know, it comes out in all kinds of protests. And what we probably don't notice is a new kind of Muslim politics is happening all over the country. It's about to come to a level where we begin to officially recognize it. But it's a new, confident Muslim politics which talks about Muslim questions, as anyone else talked about their questions. So something is moving there too in engagement with diversity. The question of class, coming from the background that I do, I would rather have preferred that this division was articulated. But the functioning of democratic politics has moved in a way that this question has actually almost been erased from public articulation. At least in the script of the revolutionaries has been completely set aside. You know, questions of economic inequality come up once in a while, but that of class-based divisions, which sort of would be articulated in the democratic politics and public domain, it's been erased almost. So much so that even to progressives, you need to remind that class exists in India, and it actually is a factor. On the much talked question of insurgency and secessionism and so on, it remains a challenge. It is a serious challenge. At the same time, it seems to me, and we can have Q&A on this, that much of the public perceptions about this, that there is almost an unholy alliance between the hawks and the doves on this question of overestimating the strength and challenge posed by some of the, especially the Naxalite and the Maoist forces in India. But then I know it's a provocative statement, we can talk about it. So all I'm saying is that in a sense what you have is entrenchment of two kinds. One is, please, why don't you take this chair? It's all right. It's meant to be occupied. Yeah. So we have two. So I've spoken of entrenchment as things taking root. I've spoken of entrenchment as protecting itself against some of the known challenges. But there's entrenchment of the third sense, which is entrapment, which is encasement, democracy being put out there for public display, but being turned harmless. And I find, just to continue with that metaphor, there are four sort of invisible walls that are coming up. I'll just mention it because we're just interested in creating a frame right now. One is economic limits to politics. My own sense is that economic limits to politics were never as severe as they are in today's India. Both in terms of instrumental control of economic interests on political players and in terms of structural constraints on what political decision making is at all possible. That's a very serious limit today. Second, ecological limits to policies. The manner in which our policy making of the last few decades has eaten into the resources of future generations and even for present generation, it creates a very serious limits to what democratic politics can do in future. Third are serious information barriers. I mean, we keep talking about, Indians love to talk about caste, class, what is it? Caste, communalism, regionalism, muscle power, money power in politics. But what we forget are really the other serious challenges, one of which is information asymmetry. information asymmetry of extraordinary variety has already entered into our political domain. It's probably not as naked as you would have in the US of A, but information asymmetry now is a very important factor in political games. And media, which is naively presented as a friend of democracy and so on, is actually as much of a challenge to democratic functioning. And finally, the fourth wall, just to continue with that metaphor of four walls, four invisible walls of democracy. The fourth wall then is about fourth wall is of severe deficit of governance, which is to say serious non-delivery of minimal public provisions, which people would expect in a normal democratic functioning. And my sense, though it might surprise some of you, is that this anti-corruption movement and the idea of corruption in India is not merely a complaint against graft, bribery of a straight kind. Corruption in India is a broad label for the entire democratic governance deficit. So when people complain about, it's similar, it's about mehengai in India. When people talk about price rise, I always say to my friends, price rise is not what economists call inflation. Price rise is a broad label to talk about lack of purchasing power. In other words, poverty. It's a different thing. So similarly, corruption is not about bribe. It's about the entire range of governance deficits, which have come to a point which is sort of very serious. So if we think of these four walls, invisible walls, and all I'm trying to say is probably as students of Indian democracy, we need to shift our gaze away from the challenges that we used to think about caste, region, ethnicity, and things of that kind, secessionism and so on, and shift it to these challenges, which really, to my mind, are the substantive challenges of democracy in the 21st century. And what you have then is entrenchment in both sense of the term, acquiring depth, root, there to stay, only game in town, at the same time a game which is a very limited game, where some substantial outcomes are ruled out. That's one frame I wanted to talk about. Second, and more quickly, about what needs to be done. How do we think about social action today? There again, you have, in some ways, much of political action in 20th century India has been an attempt to play out received scripts. There were different kinds of received scripts. Received scripts could be of how to become proper liberal democracy, and we always kept failing to be proper. There was the alternate script of trying to have a proper revolution. I'm spending my time in Providence these days to read about that script because that is what excited me for a lot of time in my life. And I'm trying to look at ideas of revolutionary equality in late 19th, early 20th century India, and how certain scripts were prepared, and India's inability to live up to those scripts. So if you look at, we could go on to that dimension to try to keep saying, okay, let's, although we failed in the last 50, 60 years, let's go back to one of those scripts and let's try and relive it properly this time. But what's happening is that history doesn't wait for anyone's script to be played out. And in many ways, the strength of Indian democracy, it's its inability and refusal to live up to the script. In a sense, now we know seriously that all societies and democracies actually, in a sense, create a script as they go along. And I see the anti-corruption protests of the last 2 years as parts of rewriting of the script, which is being written in a code, in an alphabet, which is not a familiar alphabet for us. And therefore, our first sense is to say, oh, but this is that, because we have our frames of how that protest should be, what kind of protest ought to take place, what should they do. And because this protest does not live up to those scripts, we must fit them into one of our given categories. And that's much of what I see in the last 2 years or so. This Anna Hazare agitation, which is seen as an anti-corruption agitation for Lokpal bill, etc. If you view it from some distance, Anna Hazare, the person, and I must underline that it's not that I'm saying it here in this room. I was given the honor of speaking from Ramlila Maidan when Anna Hazare was on the stage, and I said exactly this when he was sitting 2 feet away from me, which is, this agitation is not about Anna Hazare, the man. In history, people become symbols. And in a sense, this is a moment where every town, every village discovered its own Anna Hazare. And I've traveled to many parts of India to see that, there was this invention. Every moment invents its own sort of villains and its own heroes. So a certain hero was invented, but it's a moment where something in public life is discovered and invented. It was not about Lokpal. Lokpal bill happened to be just the pretext for this. The fact is that most participants in the movement did not know anything about the legal technicalities of the Lokpal movement, what was it for, what was being demanded by this side or that side, etc. It was not about corruption in that limited sense of the term. It was about corruption in the broader sense of the term, and if so, then to my mind, the developments of the last 2 years, and this is not the only time that you've had this development. In the 70s, you had the JP movement, which again at that time, if we go back, if we do not look at JP movement from the remembered history of today, but if we actually look at what the progressives were saying about JP movement at that point in the 70s, most of them thought it was a fascist movement, nothing short of that. So it's once more, popular protest of a certain kind begins to come up with its own script of how changes are to be brought about. This is, of course, an open-ended script, and this is where there is enormous need to read, to interpret, to change that script. There are moments where much more is possible than social scientists would allow for 20 years later. Because 20 years later, we all believe that what happened was the only thing that could have happened. It suits our social scientific writings, it sort of fits in perfectly. We have larger structural logic of everything to apply to that. But there are indeterminate open moments where range of possibilities is very large. And I'm proposing that at this moment we are at one such point in our history, where there are at least 2 kinds of ranges. One is this possibility, an opportunity which is not a pure opportunity, and no opportunity in history is ever pure. If it's pure, it must be plastic. It is tainted. It is a moment which comes with all dangers, with all kinds of difficulties. And in the Q&A, I could talk at length about the dangers of this moment and of what I'm calling opportunity. There are serious dangers here. But there is an opportunity, and the opportunity is that the energy of people's movements of the last 3 decades, India after 1980s, the most vibrant energy is coming from what are called new social movements. The opportunity that we have today is the energy of new social movements being converted into political democratic energy, which can reshape the Indian state. The other possibility, of course, is something we have not discussed so far, which is represented by Mr. Narendra Modi today, the persona of Mr. Narendra Modi. But again, let's not mistake it simply for communalism. It's a basket with several elements of here. There is an element of saying, there is democratic deficit, governments don't deliver, you need a strong leader. And there is, in every democracy, in Indian democracy today, more than others probably, a need for strong, visible leadership to some basic public provisions be delivered. Narendra Modi happens to combine many of these elements, but if you look at each of these elements, they are present all over. Look at YSR Reddy's Andhra Pradesh, look at Amrinder Singh's Punjab or Badal's Punjab. Certain public provisions will be provided. You don't need to ask other questions about what we are doing with mines, what we are doing with other things. That's none of your business. You are getting your basics there. So there is that element. And there is, of course, the third element of the leader himself being absolutely clean. Don't ask me about what this man on my right hand is doing, what left hand is doing, but I'm clean. So there is a package which represents the other possibility of personally clean leader, strong leadership, developmental goals, and majoritarian consensus. Majority decides, others they can live all right, and there is no genocide here. It's just second-rate citizenship being granted to you, So this is a moment of opportunity and a moment of serious danger of slide. Moments like this is where political action can make enormous difference. As I said, 30 years later, we would say what happened was the only thing that could have happened. But, or maybe I'm looking at things from too close a quarter. It could well be the case that the range of possibilities is actually quite open. And how do we begin to think and theorize this moment, the moment of today in our politics, remains a challenge. So I thought I'll just begin with these comments. It's probably longer than I intended it to be, and then we can have a conversation. Thank you.
I think you put out so much on the table that are going to get a lot of us thinking and asking. So I just wanted, I'll just kick off with just a question and then you just open it up. And so you set out, I think, quite nicely these kind of two scripts that have kind of, in a way, I think it's quite an accurate characterization that have animated both Indian politics and Indian political thought, which is the liberal script, which is, India wasn't meant to be a democracy. We've done it with, ethnic diversity, low economic development, and a variety of other things that are supposed to impede against democracy. And so, it's in this kind of exchange with Perry Anderson, a number of his Indian interlocutors, this has become a fairly politicized one, which he calls these people apologists for Indian democracy. And the second, of course, is the revolutionary script, which was in some ways in opposition to the liberal script. But it's very interesting because right at the end of your talk, you laid out what I think, and I don't know whether you want to go so far as to kind of label it a script, even though there are undertones of this going back in time, which you might, and I'm not sure I like the classification, call an authoritarian script. And perhaps this has to do with the kind of demand for clean but strong leaders. And to some extent, and I don't know whether you agree with this, you might think of this emergence, and perhaps it's not an emergence, it's always been there, it's a resurgence of this authoritarian script as responding to a failing, which I think you, again, very rightly point out, is this question of the governance deficit. And the fact that corruption, again, as you rightly say, is not just about graft and bribe and everyday corruption. It's also about an everyday service provision failure. And so you might actually think about the fact that the main failure of both the liberal and the revolutionary script might be this governance deficit or corruption, which is then exactly what leads to the resurgence of a new script of authoritarianism. So that was one, but relatedly, and this gets to this point about this critical juncture that you say we are at right now, you're absolutely right that, both from very close in India, but also in a way from being very far. So if you take the New York Times view of India, what you have are the Anna Hazare movements, and then you have all of this violence against women and the gang rape in Delhi. And so in very, very interesting ways, both of those also bring out, though on very different issues, this energy of new social movements. And so, even though you didn't necessarily think about the energy of the social movements in that way, I do think that that's a kind of important component of it. But the thing that I wanted to mention is that in some ways, there's always been a hint of conservatism and perhaps fascism, even in India's social movements. And we can debate, and obviously that is a deliberately provocative statement. And so while you might, at a first glance, think of the authoritarian script that's associated with people like Modi, and the fact that a number of people in election surveys, this goes back to Seshan as election commissioner, as people were really fond of him because he was considered this extremely strong individual who could get things done. But then if you think of the energy of new social movements, which you would think are obviously analytically and perhaps in terms of their intellectual motivations very different, I wonder if there is a way in which there is a kind of certain fascism and conservatism. I'm thinking here of the criticism of the Anna Hazare movement as well. And I wonder whether there is a way in which, even though it is highly impalatable to think of them as anywhere being close to each other, and I'm not at all suggesting that they are, that there is some undercurrent that we are desperately trying not to kind of link, or whether there is even a possible connection there, and only because you kind of brought up the JP movement and the fascist connotations, I thought I'd just kind of throw it there. But I don't at all mean to hijack the conversation. I just thought I'd put it out there. So it's up to you, Yogendra, how you want to do it. You can either respond to this, or what we can do is just collect questions, and you can kind of...
You decide. I have no time constraint. I'm happy to speak, but you decide. Maybe start with responding to you, and others can make up your mind. Yeah, sure, great. No, I'm glad you sort of brought out the essence of what I was trying to say. The more, Prerna, I think about the liberal and the Marxist scripts of the 20th century, what strikes me is the commonality between the two scripts, the Euro-normality of both the scripts. I mean, this is a phrase I borrow from Sudipta Kaviraj, who says the Euro-normality, the assumption basically is what happens in Europe is normal. Everything else is deviant, deficit, has to come up with, the normality of it. And he says somewhere very nicely, he says the compass of modern social theory has Europe as its north, or somewhere else he says in the concepts of that we deploy in social theory, somewhere contingent experiences of Europe and North America are lodged inside these concepts. The more I think about both the liberal and the Marxist script, the more I'm convinced that they share much more than they are willing to grant. The challenge of thinking about contemporary India is not therefore to discard modern social theory, because I really think it's one of the intellectual resources of humanity, modern social theory as it developed in Europe. But what we need to be able to do it is to abstract it in a genuine sense, in which modern social theory, Western European theory may not have been able to. Because it's natural that if you sit in one place, you are unable to say what really belongs to this place and what is truly general and abstract about what I'm drawing from it. So there may have been too much of that, so we need to abstract in a genuine sense. And we need to filter European social theory in one round of filtering of European social theory to see in which sense is it modern social theory and not just modern Western social theory. That's a challenge. And when I look at that and come to that question of Anna movement and its conservative fascist possibilities, I would for a moment put both the labels aside, and I would simply look at the fact that Anna movement as it unfolded for those 2 years, for a year or so, had 3 distinct streams within it. And that's actually what made it real, because it was not pure. It was not playing out to anyone's pre-designed script. It was people gathering mostly spontaneously, ill-organized, largely organized by media, television, news reporting, and so on, who were coming there. Standing there, I saw 3 streams. One was very strongly anti-political. All politicians are chores, hang them to the next lamppost, and what we need is strong, honest things. So this deep anti-politics, a politics of anti-politics was one stream of this. Second was anti-ruling party, anti-Congress more than anything else, and therefore by by default, if not by design, which favored the BJP, the dominant opposition party. I mean, most protest movements tend to, in some ways, feed the politics of opposition. So there were two. And third, there was a stream which desired alternative politics. And in a sense, highly schematically, you can see the center of the movement shifting from the first to the second to the third. At Ramlila Maidan, in its first iteration, it's the first which is the dominant. All politicians are chores. This is the dominant stream, anti-politics. But it was never anti-politics of the kind that you had in Mumbai after the terrorist attack. But there was a streak of this. For a moment, when Anna movement and now my colleagues took that decision to oppose the Congress in Hisar by-election and so on, for a moment it seemed as if the second was the dominant stream. Today the second is occupied by Baba Ramdev. First still is occupied largely by Anna and his supporters. But after that point, it shifted, the center of gravity shifted to the third one, which was not the case initially, which is a quest for alternative politics, which is where the center shifted to. But all the other two are present. And I would not say the other two are present only in Ramdev and Anna. I mean, these three tendencies are present in all the three streams, in different combinations. And yes, there is something to be worried about, a certain kind of anti-politics of it. I personally have always felt that anti-politics is anti-democratic in some deeper sense. And yes, if it becomes only anti-ruling party, it doesn't even begin to take seriously note of the serious problem. I would only say, however, that I think a certain section of Indian intellectuals tend to, not just in this case, they always tend to, misread cultural metaphors and cultural symbols. I think largely because most Indian intellectuals and most commentators, and why blame poor Perry Anderson? He's simply saying what Indian radicals have been saying for 80 years. So a certain kind of self-hatred has been transferred to some other place. But so much of radical, progressive, liberal way of looking at India has been a simple disconnect with the language, metaphors that ordinary people use in their life all the time. Like so much of socialism in Europe drew upon and built on the best of Christianity. Similarly, it is quite if you actually listen to, when scholars like you go and work, you listen to the voices on the ground. And voices on the ground, the concepts being used, practical concepts being used by people, actually are bound to reflect certain cultural symbols which come from religion, which comes from all kinds of practices. And a somewhat, a standard reaction which says any whiff of this makes you communal. I keep joking with my friends that if you because sometimes they call me Yogendra Ji, like you did. Now, if you call me Yogendra Ji, you are already dubbed RSS, because if you say hi Yogendra, that makes you progressive, radical, left-wing, revolutionary. If you said Yogendra Ji, that's a deference to a sort of cultural metaphor that we have all distanced ourselves from. So I think a lot of that was happening in Ramlila Maidan. Bharat Mata, other kind of symbols, were being used. And I personally felt that while it partly reflected on some dangers which were there in the movement, it also reflected as much on those who were reading what they were reading. And this is a long script where we have distanced ourselves so successfully from the people that at the end of it, when we bemoan about lack of our politics, I don't know what we are complaining against.
Well, the only thing I will say is that, and we can bring this up again later, is that it wasn't more the kind of BJP, RSS, Yogendra Ji kind of conservatism. It was more the conservatism, and this is why I was relating it to the kind of other big New York Times thing, which was which was this question of the protests against the gang rape, is that it was because everyone asks this question, how can this keep happening? How can a society like India continue to keep this happening, right? And so I think it was more the kind of conservatism that often came out in gender relations, and the fact that it came out again, so it was more the fascism that I think has been associated with a lot of social movements, but that's a different kind of conversation. And so maybe we'll open it up and
At some point, I'll combine this with some other question.
Absolutely.
Sure.
And
it's an important one.
I think so yeah. So maybe what we can do is now collect a few and then and just remind everyone of your name.
Sure, I'm Anush again. Yogendra, thank you very much.
Sorry, I don't mean to set the tone.
It's a good tone, actually. Thank you for that very useful overview of the structure of the conjuncture. I guess my question is, I agree. I think that the liberal and the revolutionary script do have a lot in common. But the commonality that I'm thinking of is not in the dimension of their Eurocentricity, which I completely agree with, and that has to be thoroughly provincialized. But what they did share was an agenda of transformation, of state transformation, of societal transformation. And for all their deficits, that was the script that dominated the sort of the frame we were talking about. Now the new script, or the emerging script, seems to operate in a somewhat narrowed discursive space. And of course the narrowing is precisely part of the problem. But the politics of the new social movements, the opportunistic trend or potential that you saw, seems to me to operate within the horizon of this narrowing, rather than opening it up and pushing against it. And that's my question is, in what way can we think about recovering some of the transformative energy? And then why do I say, perhaps that's an uncharitable, or one might say that's an uncharitable description of it. For me, the narrative of governance and the public service provision is precisely the key dimension of that narrative. Because it's no longer transformation, it's service provision. And the sheer dominance of that frame and the sheer dominance of the governance frame seems to me to put the sort of the grain of the system and the grain of the conjuncture with the authoritarian side more, because that has a kind of they inhabit that space more comfortably and more sort of full-throated. So I guess my question is, what pieces of the new vision recover some of the transcendent energy or some of the transformative energy without falling into the pitfalls of the parochialism
So,
my question is, like after JP movement, there was change in power. The then authoritarian rule was voted out of power. I am from Bangalore. I'm quite interested about tomorrow's outcome in the election. Since both the parties are known for corruption, but still,
in all fairness, you should say all the three. In the case of Karnataka.
but the
four.
forecast is already that the Congress might be coming back to power. That means you think it is due to the anti-incumbent feeling. And the other thing I remember is, although Mr. Session was quite well respected, I believe he didn't win the election when he contested to Parliament. That's my memory. That means people make a distinction between respect and popularity.
maybe one more. Do you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Amok. So the question I had is just looking at alternatives to the two major parties. I was wondering if there were any lessons you can draw from Pakistan, where Imran Khan is offering a viable alternative in the elections coming up this week. So what's your thoughts on that?
So we're giving very different sets of questions, but I'm sure you're
Anish, I'm really excited about what you asked, and I really would like us to carry on this conversation for not just for some time, for a few months, for years, because that really is the question here. what is this new vision and how does this new vision relate to the old one? And of course, there is a danger of sliding into the simple business of service delivery, because that which takes away from the larger view of transformative politics of the 20th century, because both liberal and Marxists are transformative in that sense of the term. And I'd sort of weave in your question here about that, the other part of the conservative dimension, which is, on the gender questions and relations and so on. Let me start by saying that this is truly a somewhat indeterminate moment in our history where the range of possibilities is pretty wide. And when we speak about range of possibilities, that of course is positive and negative. Social movements have all these possibilities. In fact, I would say when we think of social movements, I would not simply look at the last 2 years, because actually if you asked me, and I'm willing to say it again openly with everyone, if you asked me about last 30 years of history of social movement, would I say that what we saw in the last 2 years was the finest, was the strongest, was the deepest in terms of its vision? Probably not. It was certainly the most visible one. Visibility makes a difference to possibilities of politics, but the most visible is not necessarily the deepest, is not necessarily the most enduring. And that really is a political question of how do you connect a certain political possibility that opens up unanticipated, and connect it then to what has been the deepest, what is the most attractive part of history of social movements in India. And what is most attractive to someone like me is, while the social movements of the last 30 years began with their one agenda, someone with farmers, someone against the dam, someone wanted mustard rolls to be corrected in Rajasthan and so on and so forth, but gradually, by interaction, by entering the larger arena of political contestations and democratic negotiations outside the electoral domain, but democratic negotiations, they develop an alternative vision of what India's future should be like. And so Medha Patkar and NAPM do not simply speak about dams. They have a view on caste, they have a view on the nuclear question, they have a view on everything else, which is what you expect in democratic politics to happen. For me, if the new politics which has arisen after the last 2 years' experience were to draw only upon the experience of last 2 years, it will remain a very shallow politics. It has to draw upon 3 decades of engagement of social movements. And that, Prerna, to my mind, has much deeper possibilities. We must also remember that some of these movements, some of the finest movements of the last 3 decades, have been led by women, and not because they were someone's widow or someone's daughter or someone's friend, in their own right, yes, as leaders. So to my mind, some of the best democratic energy in India has been released through these social movements in the last 3 decades. What we do not have is a political vehicle for that. Someone like me thought that the sudden opening that offered itself in the last 2 years provided the possibility of a viable politics. What social movements, I've already said what these social movements did, but I did not say what they did not do. What they did not do is to understand the logic of democratic politics as it operates in the electoral competitive arena. That there are certain minimum requirements of scale. Lots of students of management here would understand, like in a firm, in politics too, you have requirements of minimum scale. you have requirements of a minimum bandwidth of issues, you require minimum cross-sectional mobilization. If you don't do these three things, you don't stand a chance in politics. This is what social movements never understood. So this is a moment when these two can be brought together. And that's why, there's sort of, I'm excited about this moment. On the 20th century ways of looking at transformation, something attracts me to that. At the same time, those who want transformation should be willing for transformation in their visions of transformation as well. Sometimes what happens, Anush, is that we want everyone to change. We want the proletariat to leave his religion, his caste, her identity. We want them to take everything. We don't want to change our letterhead. We don't want to change our flag and the book I always carried in my pocket. I think we should, in all fairness, we should demand transformation at both ends. And that is truly a transformative moment. And it's very hard because so much of transformative politics of the 20th century was of the first variety. You have these great leaders, personal sacrifice and all, but they knew what was right. And everyone else had to play out that thing. Radical politics of 21st century will have to be of a different kind, which takes practices more seriously, which is willing to draw. I agree in some ways transformative politics cannot only come from within. An element of it comes from outside always. But it is outside inside rather than outside outside. I don't know if that conveys very much, but that's my sense. But I agree, we need to retain that thing of, so to my mind, to come out of that narrowness in which social movements can easily slide, and this new politics can very easily slide, is to link to that longer legacy, richer legacy of social movements, and second is to rethink, to change our ideas of change itself. On the Karnataka question, sir, I'm very happy that I'm sitting here and not in a television studio. I'm very happy that the burden of trying to say what's going to happen in Karnataka is not on me, and this is the last thing I want. I'm very happy to get rid of some burdens in life. But all I would say is that while people can, in an electoral political competition, while people can choose from a given menu, they cannot change the menu itself. And very often, and this is what leads to frustration in politics. So what's the option? You have a Congress, you have BJP, you have JDS, Mr. Yadurappa's party, and the Reddy brothers have also floated some kind of a party. Yeah, what kind of a choice is this? And the real limitations of liberal democratic experiments carried out in whatever form is how do you get people to choose the menu itself, and how to change the menu of options available. That's a real difficult question. And Karnataka, to my mind, is as good an example as you can get, which is crying for something of that kind. Yes, it is true Mr. Sheshan did not win. At the same time, I would not be complacent to imagine that all such authoritarian ventures would be voted out by the people. I think it is true that Indian people have at some crucial moments in our history voted against authoritarian possibilities, 1977 being one of the biggest examples. But I think we tend to underestimate the element of luck that may have played in those situations. If Indira Gandhi was a little smarter and could have managed things a little different, we would have been speaking differently. And the sense of superiority that Indians have vis-a-vis what's happening in Pakistan would have taken a very different turn if only we didn't have that sort of element of luck. In that sense, I really appreciate the question you asked, because very few Indians ever turn to Pakistan and say, what can be learned from Pakistan? The question itself is such a welcome question. Because people in Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh have struggled for democracy. They know what it means to give their blood. They know what it means to fight it on the street. Indians don't know that. It came to them as a gift through something else. And therefore, as and when it is put to a test. You're not from that generation, but I've seen emergency with my eyes. I was growing up at that time. I know what ordinary people spoke about. No matter what kind of romantic histories we today write about protest against emergencies, I have seen it with my own eyes. I know my father sort of spoke something against emergency. I know the number of people who came and spoke to my mother and said, please get your husband to behave. And there was a general moral consensus in society that my father was lunatic. So later on it turns out to be a happy coincidence that Indira Gandhi loses the elections and so on. So I would not be so complacent on this. If someone were to offer, do you remember YSR Reddy? YSR Reddy, if he had lived longer, he would have won one more election, he would have won two more elections, and we know what he was doing. We know what Badals are doing in Punjab today. We know what's happening in Assam and Haryana. What's really happening is that it is the Congress leaders who have taken up a very soft majoritarian politics of the dominant caste and community in Assam and in Haryana. So it is not entirely true that the people give a fitting rebuttal to authoritarianism, etc. No, it's not so sure. If you can come up with a soft package, and please remember, if you can see the footsteps of Narendra Modi in the last few months, Narendra Modi is not going to offer Hindutva to the country. He would offer strong leadership, development, and honesty. This is the package he's going to offer, no matter what people like you and me read it here or in India. The wrapping of the package will be strong leadership, national pride, delivery of basic services. Hindutva will not be mentioned. And I do not know what resources, we have resources. I'm not saying that this package would be announced and would sweep through the country. No, it won't. But I would not simply imagine that Indian people are gifted with that kind of wisdom, that they would always defeat things of this. In other words, this is a real political struggle, as real as any other struggle in history. I wouldn't know how much we can learn from Imran Khan and his politics, partly because, like most Indians, I'm so terribly ignorant about complexities of Pakistani politics. But one thing I do want, I think in general, we can learn from democratic struggles and consequences of democratic struggles in all these three countries. The Nepalese struggle against monarchy, and all of us would remember what Indian government did on that day. India's record on some of these things has been and Indian government's record has been so utterly shameful when it comes to this. So the least we can do is to begin by asking the kind of questions you ask, no matter what the answer is, that we have to learn from democratic struggles all over the subcontinent is a good question.
Yeah, Namita.
Thank you so much for such a thought-provoking talk. I have a lot of questions. I'll try to ask just two. The first is, why is it necessary or even desirable for us to have one vision for the country, or one sort of narrative? And the reason I ask this question is precisely because of the sort of success of democratic entrenchment or sort of seeping through, is that we do have a lot of voices on the spectrum. And going away from the sort of Eurocentricity of our understanding of democratic theory, is it necessary or even desirable to have such a unified vision for the country? That's the first question. The second question is about institutions, which you've mentioned. So there's a certain narrative about institutions that, certain institutions in India have worked well, others have not. So examples, the Election Commission, the Comptroller and Auditor General's Office, bad examples, the bureaucracy, and so on. And, the judiciary is kind of yes and no in terms of how it's worked. And so what, in your view, explains why certain institutions have worked better than others. And again, there's the sort of T.N. Session kind of idea, or the Vinod Rai, like, good leader stood up against political pressures, whatever. Or was there some, I think there's something more to that, and I would like to hear your views on that. And actually another question, which is about the information barriers that you mentioned, because I thought that was really, really interesting. Because there the sort of dominant narrative seems to be that with the RTI, which was a sort of big success, a social movement struggle, that we've actually been able to increase access to information. But given what you said about the media, and also like information barriers in general, you seem to sort of disagree with that. And I was hoping you could say a bit more about that.
Beginning with that, sorry, yeah, we were sort of going to collect a few. Sorry, yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I actually have a question that's related to the last point that she mentioned, which is about the media. So I have also been, sitting with my father, watching news since I was a child. But at this age now, I feel that the media really leads us to believe things which sometimes we shouldn't, sometimes we should. And I think that maybe I or my father, we are people who are a little more aware, or probably can believe that we are more educated and wiser than the other people in the country. What are the kind of struggles that you think are there for the Indian politicians to overcome this challenge? Because I really feel that sometimes the media has a very strong agenda, which we as common people need to see through, and I think it's important. So,
my question is on what has to be done in terms of like mass mobilization. Like the example which comes to mind is Ekta Parishad. Is like the Jan Satyagraha last year and even before that. But the kind of response they were like more than marching like more than 100,000 people from MP to Delhi, and finally Jairam goes to Agra and signs and nothing comes out of that. But I also see look at it as like a pressure wall. So like people were very desperate to come out and do that. No response. So time and again it happens. On the other hand, something like another movement happens in Delhi, and like a delegation of ministers goes. Nothing comes out of that either. But still, so the kind of disproportionality of response to these two kind of movements. So how this will like play out. And the second thing is like with this governance deficit, which has become kind of a term, and it gives like a lot of power to unelected bodies like judiciary and bureaucracy, which we're actually seeing in Nepal and to some extent in Bangladesh as well. So do you see some kind of resistance in India from these unelected institutions once there's a real democratic movement starts building up?
The common question about media, I should begin by noting the positives. RTI, great positive. If you write a story of Indian democracy, this would certainly be a golden chapter, RTI, and how it's it'll be an intriguing thing of how the political class allowed this to happen, But it happens, it's they're more, we should sort of try to theorize something like a blink. The state blinks for moments. And at that moment, you can get something very major can happen in our systems, which then can have long-term implications. 73rd, 74th Amendment, RTI, clearly the state must have blinked for a moment, and something major happens. The other things can be very disastrous in that moment of blink, but anyway, so RTI is definitely a very positive story. Also, simple diversification of media. You simply cannot keep a story out now. You can suppress it, you can restrict its circulation, but you cannot blank out. Even Mr. Ambani cannot ensure a complete ban on the media. Simple diversification, small media, social media, all this sort of ends up creating a situation where it's difficult to completely erase things. So these are positives. This day before yesterday, we had our Anirudh Bahel's disclosures. These kinds of things can happen, so that's positive. What worries me is that last 20 years or so have seen an explosion of both print and electronic media in the country. It's an explosion of the kind print media which you probably don't see anywhere else in the world, because in most of the developed world, it's actually decline of print media. In India, it's a period of explosion of print media. What has happened with the explosion of print media is simultaneously increase in the depth of the reach of media is unimaginable today. In my village, when I went 10 years ago, I had to wait till 10 o'clock or 12 o'clock for someone to drop one newspaper, which will be carried by a bus conductor, and he would drive it out of concern and charity and so on. He would bring it from the town. Now, more than 100 newspapers are delivered at 5 in the morning in my village. It's unimaginable. The change is huge. With this has happened localization of media, which is to say, unless 25 people get killed, whatever happens in my district is no news at all for the next district. There's complete localization of print media, which has led to fragmentation of information of a kind. If you actually read the newspapers that people actually read in my place, Rewari or Jabalpur or wherever, they do not read what we read on the internet. The edition they actually read is 80% local news and tiny bits of local, of regional, national, global news. So there's a serious fragmentation of media that has happened. Along with it has, of course, come a very careful agenda setting. I do not mean to reduce it only to the question of ownership, because several things are happening here. A media which was always a media of the educated, English-speaking, urban, middle classes, so-called middle class. Middle class is a euphemism for the Indian ruling class, because every ruling class has no ruling class in the world calls itself a ruling class. They all have a euphemism for itself. Middle class in India, because it's in the middle of nowhere. People are 95 percentile and above call themselves middle class. So Indian media always was of the middle classes. It is becoming for the middle classes for the first time, seriously and consciously so, especially the English media. Now says, yes, this is the class we are producing it for. What's wrong with this? That's a very significant change. So it's a change there. And we should not undervalue the changes in ownership. I don't know how many of us have been following the changes in the ownership pattern of electronic media in India in the last 2 or 3 years. Basically, there is a serious possibility that the biggest corporate house of this country, of India, will also be the biggest media power of India. Now, the implication for democracy of something like this are things which should not be confined just to discourse analysis and textual analysis. I mean, the good old political economy of ownership is, I mean, I'm amazed that we are not carrying out that kind. Only Paranjya Guha Thakuta keeps writing about it. But that good old political economy of the straight variety is so badly needed to understand what's happening in media in India today. You know? So this is why I'm worried about the media. We could go into instance after instance, and I'm not even speaking about the crass things like media news for sale. And it's not a limited phenomena. It's not those a few rogue papers. The largest English newspaper chain of India has written private treaties. And this euphemism stands for the following. They have written legally binding agreement with corporations which say, you give us this much of equity, in turn we will give you this much of positive news coverage, not advertisements, through the year. These are legal binding arrangements in place, again not being talked about. You know. So I mean, this is what makes me worried. You know, and although we are still not in that stage where you need $800 million before you become a serious contender for presidential election, or was it more this time? More like $1 billion or something, yeah? But we are going in that direction. And that's something which needs very careful analysis. On the institutions, why some institutions do well and others don't, really, I mean, it's a very good question. I shouldn't even attempt an answer. The best answer is to say, honestly, I don't have an answer. The way we can begin to think of an answer is to actually write institutional histories, to say, because all the institutions which we today say do well, all began doing well by in a moment of reckless adventure. It was P.N. Bhagwati for the Supreme Court, it is Sheshan for Election Commission, and Rai for the CAG. These are moments of reckless adventure, in some cases which actually violated the law. So it is precisely by defying this legal script that Indian institutions ended up performing, and in some cases by persons who would not wish to spend much time with, people who are completely egotist vision of the world. So Indian institutions have performed through such accidents, wherever such accident did not take place. But that's hardly a theory, so we really need to think about it. So the best way is to say no answer. Why do we need one vision? You're right, we don't need one vision. I think the question of oneness should be seen differently. What is a unified way of looking at India? One unified way of looking at India would be to say, here is my recipe, it applies everywhere. This is how many people thought of writing about India, Indian politics, and so on. And you're absolutely right to say that this has collapsed in the last 15 years, and thank God it has. That Orissa has its own ways of looking at, it is like France finally being able to say we have French politics, Germans being able to say we have German politics. I mean, this is so good. But this does not and should not mean that we surrender the idea of being able to link these various scripts in a way which then becomes an Indian script. So it's the Indianness of Indian script which can be seen in different ways. One is a unified script being applied everywhere. The other is not a disjointed script, a script which brings them in a compositional unity. These are different elements but which are composed together. This is how Rabindranath Tagore saw India, and I think this is how students of Indian politics should begin to see India. On the question about, Ekta Parishad has been an experiment that has excited me and has also disappointed me. I said when those 1 lakh people were marching, I actually said that look, and we were in Delhi at that point doing demonstration with 5,000 or 10,000 people, and I actually said, don't those 1 lakh people deserve more of media attention than we do? We're just 5,000 people out here, they're marching and so on. So that clearly is the case. And if you would recall, it doesn't for various reasons, it so happened that what is called Anna movement people tend to read a lot of conspiracies in it. If you do not read conspiracies and look at it from a distance and try and analyze it, what was that strange configuration which gave it suddenly that kind of momentary visibility? It's been momentary. After that, the visibility has certainly plummeted, especially after we spoke about Mukesh Ambani. We were put in our place. So that's all fine. So that momentary visibility is a very unusual syndrome. So what happened to Ekta Parishad is what happens to every single social movement of the country. I remember 10-15 years ago, the CPI-ML had a demonstration in India. This was the IPF days of the ML. They brought 1 million people to the city of Delhi. This is 1 decade ago, probably a little more. I'm getting old now. And all the English newspapers of Delhi reported it as a traffic obstacle. This is 10-15 years ago. So, this is how movements have been treated in general. Ekta Parishad got exactly that. The other lesson, so in a sense that's not so unusual, but the lesson to learn from Ekta Parishad is that Ekta Parishad agitation, and I say this as someone who feels very close to Rajgopalji, has been involved in conversations. You know, Ekta Parishad experiment. This is a Gandhian, one of the few younger generation of Gandhians who actually mobilized the landless poor for a march to Delhi to demand land, piece of land. The difficulty was that in this entire mobilization, it agreed to live by a certain external political boundary. In other words, Ekta Parishad did not have a politics of its own. And I say this with some information because one kind of agitational movement politics can go on transgressing the rules of power. Another movement would say, I will break this much and no further. And if you get in the business of this much and no further, and if you agree not to become a political threat, then politicians know how to deal with you. I'm surprised that we all are surprised that nothing happened after last time's meeting, because this is exactly what had happened 4 years ago. There was a march, Prime Minister gave an assurance, Prime Minister did not hold one single meeting after that assurance. And we have another march that ends with another assurance. So it tells you how, you know, I mean, it reminds you of virtues of politics.
So unfortunately we're out of time because I think we could go on for a very long time. But really thank you. There's nothing more that we can say. But thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts and for allowing us to air some of ours and then to get your responses in turn. So it's been fantastic and thank you again.
Thank you. Delighted. Thank you very much. I'm glad we could have this open exchange.